Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AAD Books season. We are here today to present and celebrate the book Critical Neighborhoods, The Architecture of Contested Communities, a book published by Park Books in late 2022. My name is Paulo Moreira. I'm the editor of the book, and today we have here a group of amazing contributors, Elisa Silva, Julia King, and Matthew Barac in the room. And we will introduce ourselves very briefly first, then we will share the screen and make short presentations about the contributions we made for the book. And later on, we will be in conversation with anyone else who is interested to jump in. I'm thrilled to be able to present the book here. It's a very long project, so it's definitely very good feeling to hold the book in the hands and share even virtually this event. I'm an architect and researcher based in Porto, in Portugal, where I'm standing at the moment. I run a practice which is mainly concerned with the context of urban conflict and social deprivation. Previously, I did my PhD at London Met, and hence I'm very, very happy to be back to the school, even if virtually today. Maybe we could make this round, so perhaps following the order that we'll present, starting with Elisa. Elisa, can you introduce yourself to us?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending, and thank you to the organizers for putting all of this together. I am one of the contributors to Critical Neighborhoods with a chapter that is in Caracas, Venezuela. It's where my practice is, which is named Enlace Arquitectura, and we're also an NGO called Enlace Foundation. I was my let's say education is a master's degree in architecture from the GSD at Harvard. And since 2007, I've had a practice in Caracas, Venezuela. It's centered largely on what we call barrios, or poorly called informal settlements. You know, part of the conundrum is that we don't have a proper name for territories that actually represent the home of, in the case of Venezuela, it's at least half of the population. And many other things that I could say, but I think I'll leave it there and pass on the baton to Julia King.
Hi, evening everyone. Thanks for coming. So yeah, my name's Julia. I trained as an architect, but I think live the life of an academic right now. I've been at the LSE for 7 years, and before that, did my PhD with Paulo at London Met. So it's really good to be back. I have a big space in my heart for London Met. Paulo and I had the immense honor to do our evening classes with Peter Carl when he was there, and then and that sort of opened up a decade of working on sewage projects in India, which is what I'll be talking about now. But I feel I have like connections with Elisa. I'm also Venezuelan, even though I ended up doing work in India because that's where I grew up, and through Matthew, because Matthew was a dear friend and colleague of my mentor, Susie Hall, at the LSE. So I feel it's been a really great opportunity to work with people I really admire on this book. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I think I'm next. I should just let you know that according to our privacy policy, I'm supposed to remind everybody that you're being recorded, and if you don't want to be seen, please put your cameras off, but most of you have put your cameras off already. So thank you from the point of view of London Metropolitan. My name is Matthew Barac, and I'm a professor of architecture and urban culture here at London Metropolitan. As Julia mentioned, Peter Carl was my PhD supervisor, and I started working at London Metropolitan the year that he left. So he kind of passed the baton to me. I knew Julia's work very well at that point, and I've known Paulo's very well because I ended up being one of his PhD supervisors, and I had the pleasure of meeting Elisa through this project. So we are all a big happy family. And it's great to have reconnected again through this project, especially during the time of the pandemic. So after that introduction from all of us, I'm going to hand back to Paulo, who can kick us off with the presentation proper, and Paulo will explain the rationale. Paulo, I'll start sharing your screen, if that's all right.
Yes, please. Great.
Just a second.
So I will kick off the presentations. Each one has around 10 minutes, and then we will have still some minutes for conversation. Well, this book is inspired by my doctoral research into the relationship between the neighborhood of Chicala and its wider city, Luanda, in Angola. I was motivated to produce the publication as a dialogue between different neighborhoods, basically by the fact that I did not want to look back on my PhD as something I did in the past, or to publish my thesis as a book, as if shelving the whole process. I wanted the research to continue in some way. Maybe the next slide. We were in a context of lockdown when I started this dialogue with Elisa and Julia, whose work I followed and admired. And from these online conversations, the book started to take shape. The next slide, please. This is the contents page of the book. We organized it as a mappa mundi to highlight the fact that we're focusing on neighborhoods in 3 different continents. La Palomera in Caracas, Venezuela, studied by Elisa Silva. Tea Camp in New Delhi, India, explored by Julia King, and my own work in Chicala in Angola. And when discussing our projects and working methods and so on, it became clear that the book would benefit from additional thoughts beyond these 3 case studies, as well as from external perspectives, let's say. We invited Matthew Barac to moderate a dialogue between us 3. Matthew will show us some of the highlights of that conversation, I guess. He was joined by 2 opening and closing texts. The concluding one is by Ines Weizman, a reflection, a more theoretical reflection on the role of architects as critical spatial practitioners. And the opening preface is by Abdou Maliq Simone, who was my external examiner in my PhD, and he very kindly agreed to write a text for this book. Next slide, please. I have a very short quote by Abdou Maliq when he concludes the preface, saying that neighborhood as critique, as well as an embodiment of critical functions, this is the shared agenda that the authors seek to document and understand in this important book, a challenge that poses new questions and opportunities for an engaged architecture. Next one, please. I will basically follow the structure of the book that you understand a little bit context for the chapters. In the introduction, I try to contextualize the works and the chapters that and looking at what brings us together as researchers and practitioners. I try to look beyond the geographic context and show how the methodologies that we use are actually shared in our works in different levels, let's say, but we all try to learn about human habitat related to spatial issues connected with broader economics, political questions, and in the giving an emphasis on the reciprocities between them. I try to summarize these communal points in these 7 methods that you can read in the screen. This is a kind of a toolkit of methods used in our projects, but they could be ultimately applied to in different degrees to architectural projects in contested communities elsewhere. That's my approach, at least. The methods don't have any particular order. There might be connections between different methods, and of course there are overlaps, but this is my systematization. The chapters then start, maybe the next slide, the chapters start with a question: why Chicala, why La Palomera, why T-Camp, why critical neighborhoods, basically. And this is my answer, the initial answer to the question. I will not present the content of the chapter itself because I want to leave some interest in the air that you can maybe buy the book and read the book, but maybe some extra slides to show a few images that relate to the process. Maybe Matthew, can you take us through the next? Chicala is a neighborhood that is disappearing. So this is how it looked not long ago, when almost half of the neighborhood was demolished to give way and give place to a new development. So the knowing that the site would disappear, I felt urgent to record and document this place, its spatial qualities and its social structures as well. Next. Next slide, please. Became a very good friend. So one before. So a good friend of Luis Damião. He's here looking at the archive of his late father, Cota 50. He was a photojournalist living in Chicala since the 1980s, and the photojournalist died in 2020, and we and the family was inviting me or asking me to help or to collaborate in organizing this vast archive of photography, and I've been working in this project since. And this is something I really value because it's a continuation of the surveys and the relationship that we started back in 2010, already a few years back. Luis is a photographer himself. Can you show the next slide? And one way of continuing this legacy and using the memories of the archive and how Cota 50 portrayed the neighborhood in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, I was able to invite Luis to Portugal to for an art residency in a place I run, connected with my studio, called the Instituto. Luis was working transforming his father's photographs in some of his own artworks. Maybe the next slide. Meanwhile, Lino Damião, Luis' brother, also a visual artist, worked together with Nelo Teixeira, artist from Chicala, both artists from Chicala, in an installation that recreates a fragment of Chicala, especially this quintal or this courtyard place where these friends grew up. And the project, this is to say that even when a disappearing community is inevitable, we can contribute to consolidate its memories and its collective memories. This is something I see as almost like a never-ending process. We can carry on working around this archive for many years in many different formats. The next slide, please. Even the cover of the book is a homage to Cota 50. Is one of his photographs. It's Django, this small shed in the courtyard next to the water side. And I felt it would be the best way I thought of to bring a cover to the book. So can you show the next slide, please? The experience that I had in Chicala has been very important in developing my own practice elsewhere. This is a page of the conversation chapter where I show 3 small improvements in water points in outskirts of Luanda in different neighborhoods. It's a project, part of a postdoc fellowship I just finished at the Faculty of Architecture in Lisbon. And this is also a way of learning from a very long experience in Chicala with many groups of students and collaboration from the university there to survey the site, to understand how the site works, its history, its urban culture. And those learnings have been very providential and very important to carry on further projects. And that's something I realized we all share in common. From the experiences we use in the chapters, we can develop new projects elsewhere. Next slide. This meaning not only research-based projects, but really practical actions and solutions. This is a detail of one of the water points we did with elevated water point that allows women because I mean mostly women that carry water, that's how it is. But it's a small scale project, but I think I'm interested in seeing how, you know, how these small scale projects can have an impact in the daily lives in this case in the communities of Funda, outskirts of Luanda. Next slide, please. I'm also looking at projects here in Portugal where I realized we also have many vulnerable communities and neighborhoods that are mostly illegal in terms of the built part itself, but this is Monte Xisto. It's a hill in the outskirts of Porto, and I'm engaged at the moment with these sites and trying to find cases where I can practice my architecture practice, but also my cultural practice, inviting artists from Angola, in this case Vercron Collective, that made this urban art along the stair of Monte Xisto. And by doing these projects, we are able to also to continue a dialogue together between the people that I met along the way and whose work I follow, but not only follow, I enjoy collaborating and making links between art and architecture in my own practice. Next slide. I think these are details of the Monte Xisto project. It's basically it's a ruin at the bottom of the hill, very close to the riverbed, and the project allowed to connect this derelict neighborhood with nature and a very beautiful site next to it, and trying to use also the artwork to raise awareness about these forgotten and invisible places in our cities. And this is a very recent photo of a trail that was organized by the local residents that shows how the site becomes activated by some activities and events and becomes a better public space. I think it's the last slide I had, so thank you, everyone. I will ask Elisa to share with us her presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share my presentation and hopefully get this to work a little better. Let's see.
If you can do it in full screen, would be better.
Right, which I might not figure that out again this time. It's apparently not possible with this, but I had been able to get this much done. This might be as good as it gets. So I wanted to talk about the case study that happens in La Palomera in Caracas, Venezuela. And I would also like to, at the same time, I think I should explain our practice, which is divided into a, let's say, commercial practice, which is Enlace Arquitectura, and an NGO, which is Enlace Foundation and Fundación. It's been registered both in Venezuela and the US. And this is the setting of my work. This is the city of Caracas, and it sits right in the valley south of the Avila mountain. And on the other side of the mountain, you would have the Caribbean Ocean. But a lot of the city, of course, is also a self-built neighborhood, or a barrio, as we call them. It's the home of half of the population, at least in Caracas, and they cover 25% of the urban footprint in the city. And this is something that informed earlier works, for example, CABA, Cartography of the Caracas Barrios, which records the whole history of how barrios evolved in the city, in a publication that is an A3 format, and helped a great deal in terms of making this existence visible to not only people that live in the barrios, who definitely know these places are their homes, but to a broader audience. And another part of our work, which then quickly folded after that, was to research in all sorts of latitudes within Latin America what public space has done in communities in terms of integrating them. And we had opportunities to do sort of collaborations with neighborhoods regarding public space. This one is in Tabellín, and this one is in Petare in Caracas. And then we started working in La Palomera in 2016 with a couple of spaces. This one was a waste collection kind of site that, together with the neighbors, we decided to transform into a small plaza. And this space was a parking lot for many neighbors' vehicles that we negotiated to let that be a playground for children. I think the critical moment here for us was, how do you actually present public space as an agent of integration? And perhaps it actually is a much more complex, and we as architects tend to kind of give ourselves too much credit in thinking that formal interventions do things. I teamed up at this point with Cheo Carvajal in Caracas, who had been for many years conducting this fantastic initiative with the neighbors of El Calvario, where on the day of the Christmas Parranda, which is a big kind of music festival, neighbors would also open their homes and host readings of books, concerts, all sorts of instruments, including violins and saxophones, dances, concerts by people like Aquiles Baez, who recently passed. And that, over the years, has attracted a great deal of attention. And that was sort of the beginning of this process, which is what is documented in the chapter in Critical Neighborhoods. Integration Process Caracas was an initiative that started here in La Palomera, towards the south of the map. And you can see it here as a kind of a urban fabric that's different than the historic colonial. This was all produced with the plan of the Indies, as you can see with a regular grid. And this would be La Palomera, which is the home of 6,000 inhabitants approximately, and it covers 15 hectares. It is subdivided itself into many smaller kind of segments that people they see themselves as belonging to Copacabana or Acequia or La Ceiba, even though this is the larger neighborhoods called La Palomera. It's typical. And this initiative or program tried to be more inquisitive, researching and connecting with people, looking to find other types of answers. The first was a big invitation to the entire city, to the neighbors of La Palomera, that began in Bolivar Square, reading a manifesto that Cheo Carvajal had written. And I've translated this part into English because I think it's quite germane. So what does a barrio need? Does it need assistance? Does it need to be intervened? The barrio is neither sick nor a disease. What then does the barrio need? Acknowledgement. It needs acknowledgement as part of the city. Continuing to think of the barrio as an urban illness does not help understand it as an active part of the city lived by everyone. And so I won't go into detail, but we did host so many activities. We celebrated the Cross of May with the community. We had an open call for artists to propose projects that would work closely with the community. For example, these are two dancers of traditional dance in Venezuela who worked with the high school students. This was a project of contemporary dancers with a food kitchen. Other artists with a high school nearby, and the adolescents making engravings of La Palomera, and a survey of the gardens and all the vegetation that grows there. We played boche, or petanque as it's called in France, or bola criolla as we call it in Venezuela, with the neighbors. We heard the stories of how the neighborhood began with the La Palomera goes all the way back to the late 30s. We invited botanists and landscape architects to tour the gardens of La Palomera. This is the celebration of the Cross of May, which became fused with our own addition to their traditions by making a very large-scale model at 1 to 200 that processed through the neighborhood and was reassembled at the top for us to talk about this and the larger city. The drawing that you see here tries to convey that event. And this is the model reassembled at the top. Afterwards, we danced. Dancing is a big part of what we do. And it is such an amazing way to share in space, create sort of emotions and affections between folks that live somewhere else and the neighbors of La Palomera. And then the other challenge of all this work was to bring it into a, culture center, something that is perceived to be a place for, art exhibitions, etc., and to have everybody in the city that partakes of this place called La Hacienda de la Trinidad, and to engage a part of their city that they have not been presented in this light as a place with incredible knowledge about how to garden, beautiful gardens as opposed to what they imagine is a barrio. Amazing species that grow in the tropics, 260 of them. It's a place of incredible biodiversity. And this is what we explained, and the narratives of the barrio that we were sharing with a larger audience, even through a newspaper that records the good news about La Palomera and how a home in La Palomera functions, which the case of Mr. Calisto's home is both a culinary kitchen, a vegetable garden. He has chickens. He lives there. His daughter used to do workshops with children doing artwork. And this archive of our experience was produced so that it could be replicated perhaps or serve other communities. We had the good fortune of presenting this at the biennial in Venice 2 years ago. And it has evolved into other presentations. These were maps of the gardens of La Palomera produced for a recent exhibition in Miami. And these axiometric drawings, which are the gardens as they exist, not designed from drawing into reality, but the reality taken back into drawing. And we, a la Duchamp, made small boîtes à valises to share with neighbors of that experience, and which you can also find here at lapalomera.org. And to conclude, there are two concrete changes in the neighborhood that came about because of this. One is waste here in this barrio, and every barrio in Venezuela is collected in a very poor quality fashion, where open air containers are placed at the bottom of the hill where a waste garbage truck, a conventional one, can pass. So working with the municipality and the service provider, we changed that, and now it's picked up door to door, dispensing with that container. And now we have this lovely kind of garden that the neighbors upkeep. And this space, which had been abandoned for many, many years, even 3 decades, was shared with us by the community with a big party, obviously, at the beginning, but then little by little with contributions from various embassies and workshops on how to change it and improve it and collect water and learn together how to collect water. This has been transforming into a center for art and culture with music lessons and storytelling and a culinary kitchen and chocolate. And this is a joropo and a market. And more proposals are coming from the community to activate this space. And the last edition was a library. So we have 35 events now weekly and more than 14 groups that are using this space. This was a meeting last year, and we're about to have a meeting this year, now giving every single person that is a part of this group a key of their own to use this. And to conclude, I just want to share the pedagogy that has been so important for me to learn in all this experiences, that we tend to, as architects, think of places as being problems that need to be solved. And this is a quote that I came across recently by Jean-François Lyotard, which is, what do we have to cure? I don't know exactly, but first and foremost, the illness of the desire to cure. And I will glance over this and not read it, but Stan Allen has an amazing kind of perspective on this tendency of architects to see their roles as controlling. And once you divorce yourself of that, the potential that is amazingly much greater to transcend as a discipline. And so with that, I will leave you and maybe go on to discussions further, but pass on the microphone to Julia.
Thanks so much, Elisa. So after seeing that incredible work, I am now going to, sorry, I need to do this in the beginning. After seeing that incredible successes, which is amazing, I'm now going to talk about failure, actually. And that's the subject of my chapter in the book. And I am going to talk about it and linger on it. And I hope that that doesn't mean that you don't want to buy the book. And the book goes in depth and is you can reference it. And I'm going to do a very light touch today. But I think failure, is something that's really interesting, because it is understood in a pejorative way. But and in many sense, it's a failure to kind of work to resolve something. And sometimes that's not okay. And I think it was when we were writing, when I was writing this chapter and we were working on this book, it was during the pandemic. And I had so many moments where I was thinking in the confines of my living room, God, I wish that project hadn't failed. And I could be showing you images here, like Elisa, of people activating something that I designed. But from a point of pedagogy, failure is really important. And I think I've learned more from failures than I have from successes. And so I thought, in that context, when Paulo asked me to write something, I thought I would take an opportunity to think about that. And so for this story that I'm going to tell you, I'm going to take you to a place called Tea Camp. A lot of my work that I'm, I guess, better known for was in this dot here, number 7, out on the periphery of Delhi, which is where I did my PhD when I was at London Met. And that was arguably a success. If I won awards for it, so I guess that's a metric of success in architecture. And this was a completely different experience for me. This place where I ended up, it's a longer story, is right around the corner from where I lived. It was a sort of 10-minute Uber drive, which became very important, and you'll see why in images later on. And so in that sense, Tea Camp was very different to other places that I'd been, reminded me a lot more of the kind of places that I grew up seeing in Venezuela. Very tight, dense. This particular site had about 350 people, one never knows. And as you can see from these images, I mean, incredibly dense urban community, largely of sort of Bengalis from the Bengal region who'd moved there about 30 years ago. So it was very established. and definitely had a sense of it being a neighborhood and a community. However, there were a lot of people who'd moved in who were sort of renting rooms or renting annexes, who were part of a more iterant population of migrant workers, largely male. And my first entry, I was coming off the back of this kind of success that I'd had in of delivering a piece of sanitation infrastructure somewhere else in Delhi. And I guess with the kind of confidence that success gives you, when I arrived at TCAMP for the first time, I was asked to kind of reflect on how in a very dense area, we could put in toilets where the houses weren't robust enough to actually hold them. And so this was, I mean, a method of how I worked at the time. I mean, I've always worked very light touch, as in very under-resourced. And so this is really an image and some sketching on an iPad. And the proposal here was quite simple. It was thinking of like an infrastructural column where the toilet could be freestanding, so you could kind of sit it in just in front of the house, and it could tap into this drain that was supposedly coming. And I was also asked to sort of do a bit of thinking on that drain and what that would look like. Unlike my previous work, this was taking this settlement and connecting it into existing state infrastructure, which had actually been allowed, and that the community had negotiated. And the NGO that I had this long-standing relationship with, thanks to my PhD, called CURE, the Centre for Urban and Regional Excellence, was actually hand-holding the community into this process of putting that drain in. And so this was kind of sort of my first kind of, sketch on a napkin kind of thing. And then I left. I actually left to come back to the UK to finish my PhD, which for me professionally was like being in 5th gear and then going into 1st gear, which was really tough. But the great thing was I've had the privilege that I've been able to actually sustain myself to work in this sector beyond my PhD. So in 2016, I came back. I was on a different project, different funding stream, and now as a professional, now as an academic at the LSE. And I went back to TCAMP, and to my delight, there was a drain. And so TCAMP was now connected into the city infrastructure. And I just found this incredible. And one of the things that, for those of you who've been to Delhi or are from Delhi, I don't know, you never know if you're out there, most settlements like this will have these sort of shallow drains that run along the edge of the street. And these take rainwater, but unfortunately then take everything else. And one of the amazing innovations that the local kind of leader put in place was he sort of created these sort of little holes, which you can see just north, which is where water would drain. I found it kind of amazing. And one of my efforts has been, in a way of kind of, not fixing, I think what Elisa was just saying, and kind of toning down your expertise. I've taken a lot of my research as an opportunity to learn from how people who actually do know more than us and how they tackle these really tough problems of, let's say, sanitation in a context of a neighborhood with few resources. And so when I arrived in 2016, I met this woman to the left, and she showed me how she, whilst at the time didn't have the resources to connect into that drain that I've just shown you, she was ready for it, and so had paid for that kind of connection in the inlet. And then when I had the good fortune to then come back the following year and went back to see her, to my amazement, there was her toilet. Yes, it's very cramped. Yes, it's tiny. And in the book, I refer to this as a kind of a priori case of architecture without architects. That doesn't meet any kind of code, but it fits. It works, and she now has a toilet, and very neatly the bamboo staircase has been replaced by a concrete one, which leads you to the upstairs, which has now been activated and is a resource for this house. And this really got me thinking, because I was actually more operating now as a researcher than as an architect. And I was really interested in how people had put toilets into their homes and what was the barrier. And so the first thing was to kind of mapping is sort of central to my practice, and map where the toilets are. So yellow are the toilets. And I ended up very intrigued by this kind of courtyard that didn't have any toilets. Sorry, the red box should be slightly to the right. I moved it haphazardly. By this courtyard where you can see this tight surrounding of housings around it. And this is a photograph of what this courtyard looks like. And why I was interested was that despite the drain arriving directly into this courtyard, not a single household had connected into it. And when I surveyed the entire neighborhood, yes, money was an issue, predictably. But actually, as many people cited money, the same, if the equal numbers cited the lack of, that their houses structurally couldn't take it. The money thing I can't necessarily help with, but the structural stuff, I thought, this is an architectural project now. And that sort of started getting me thinking and working with this group mainly, but also sort of just the people around it, going, well, how could we bring sanitation in? But the first question is always, well, if you don't have toilets, what do you do? And so I was taken to this as the local toilet complex. And actually, trust me, this is a fantastic community toilet complex. I have been to many in Delhi, and this one was great. It's clean and it's got running water. And, you know, it was an incredible feat, but it was completely overwhelmed because it was servicing way too many people. The manager, the caretaker told me, you know, you've got about 2,000 women using this in a 2-hour period in the mornings. You know, it's incredibly resilient. But one of the problems is, and this is a wider, bigger problem about society, was that the toilet was shut at night because women were facing too much harassment. And so rather than tackling the harassment problem, let's just close the toilets. So we then started thinking about, well, how could we stitch into this courtyard a kind of an extension of that provision? And this was one of the sort of sketches that we were pushing to put in a toilet. And Suleka that's her house, and she became this kind of critical character for the development of this project. And she said, yeah, you can use the back of my house. And so the design was really simple. It was to kind of create a common access to the second floor, which currently was loads of different little ladders, and then a very sort of simple structure, which would hold the toilet on the back of Suleka's house, so not obstructing any existing windows, and then to put a water tank on top. So really, really basic. And this, I think sometimes, yeah, it's incredibly basic, but it was about a year's worth of work, maybe more actually. And a lot of that work, in order to speak to people because they had jobs and lives, happened kind of like at 8:30 or at 7 or even at 9 at night, where we would go. There's Rashi Mehra, who is an ex-student and then worked with me on this project. We would go pin up drawings in this courtyard and with our mobile phones shine light onto them and have conversations. And I think, yeah, it's a difficult practice, I guess, is what I'm trying to communicate with this image. And what we found, and now this is a terrible drawing, so please apologies. What we found was that the toilet, that putting this toilet in was really problematic. Principally, I think, because there were more men who lived here than women, and the needs are different. So and there was a kind of a gendered issue that women didn't have as much of a voice. There was then a secondary issue that of like peace. Collaborating and sharing is hard. Imagine if you had to share your toilet with everyone on your road. I guarantee you would have fights, and it would be a problem. And so there was a lot of conversations about how we mitigate against that problem and how we create a place where you can share, because people were very like, look, we've finally got peace with this courtyard. I don't want to disturb that peace. As I said, collaborating is hard, and our privilege, assuming we are all privileged watching this call, is that we don't have to do that. And so we kind of resolved all these issues and tensions, you know, two brothers hated each other and things like that, by saying, right, let's test it out. So let's make this thing entirely demountable. Let's use it only when the females' toilets are shut. And if you don't like it, we'll take it down in 3 months and move it elsewhere. And then I came back the next day, and it was just, I don't know, the project was not happening. And what happened was that in the interim of my morning meeting the day before and coming back the next day, was that someone from the redevelopment of Srinivas Puri had shown up. And this had put the fear of God into the residents of T Camp, because T Camp on the left has no place in the redevelopment of Srinivas Puri and the images on the right. And everyone who lives in T Camp knows that the second that vision is coming, they are out. And all of a sudden, their priorities became existential, and the toilet was never going to happen. And so in many sense, I actually think, and I write about this in the chapter of the book, that is not a failure of my project. That is a failure of the context in which I was working in, and in which T Camp exists. It's a failure of the state to build enough affordable housing. It's a failure of imagination of that vision, which is just terrible. It's a failure of the market, of architects, of so many people. And that's the failure. And in many ways, the failure is not mine. And so in the chapter, I talk about the importance of these types of projects and these methodologies. And just quickly, I think I've probably gone on for too long. For me, I have worked, and very much when I was just a student and kind of coming out of that, I worked very intuitively. But I think what underpins my work is this idea of meaningful participation. And something I return to over and over again is Arnstein's ladder of participation that was done all the way back in '69, where she talks about, non-participation and manipulation all the way up to citizen control. And more recent work that I've been doing is thinking about my role as an academic within the LSE. And I've recently set up this thing called the Apprenticeship in City Design, where I hire young people, not aspiring architects, just young people who live in cities, and particularly in London, and where I train them, and then we deliver projects. And so one of the first ones is this piece of public space, and there's a online through LSE, you can read a graphic novel that I commissioned about this story. And more recently, I've been focusing on working with young girls in public space. And there's a video online, which you can also see, or get in touch with me if you want to hear more about it. But in sum, and these are some of the conclusions that I rest on in the chapter, this kind of work relies on regular long-term relationships. And for that to happen, it requires that the state or the private sector to actually value that, to genuinely value these kinds of approaches. And there's a real problem for us who have practiced the kind of politics of patience, the slow and high social investment required by community-led planning, because cities right now are moving and changing so aggressively and so quickly, which I think actually requires us to think differently about how we work. And so on that, I'm going to say thank you. I hope I haven't talked for too long, and I look forward to discussing this afterwards.
Thanks. So I'm going to go next, and I'll be the final presenter before we go back to discussion. We have had quite a few people joining us along the way, so welcome those of you who weren't here at the beginning. And we started a little late, but we will still try to end at, sorry, I just have to get this right. Try to end at 7 p.m. Okay, hopefully you can all see my screen. Oops, sorry, no, you can't. Yes,
can.
You can. Okay, good. All right, good. So those three presentations were terrific, and as Paulo said at the beginning, he gave me a call and told me about the plan for this book and asked me if I would be interested to develop a chapter as in the form of moderating a dialogue. And once we'd talked about it for a little while, I started to realize that I could really see value in what that could be, not just as a moderated dialogue, if you like, but something else which might not at face value be immediately evident. And I'm going to come to that. I want to delve a little bit into the form, the kind of theoretical and even the epistemological implication of working in this way, which I feel has been very productive. And in fact, I think it adds a lot of value. The whole approach of the book adds value. It gives the impression of being a fairly conventional book, but in fact, it adds up to something much more. And I think all the parts of the book, yes, as I said, add up to something new. So we've already established the chapter sequence of this book. My bit is circled on the bottom right-hand side, in that it seems to figure really as a culmination or as a reflection on 3 case studies in different specific neighborhoods in Luanda, Caracas, and New Delhi. If I can just say that anybody who can see the screen with the sign for people waiting in the lobby, please click on it, because I can't do it while I'm presenting. What I'm going to do in my reflection, so that I don't go on for too long, is I'm going to just focus my remarks on a few points, but just to give you a bit of background. Firstly, the book is not necessarily as linear as it immediately appears to be. Abdou Maliq Simone in his preface writes that one of the book's primary characteristics is that it encompasses a diverse set of media and presentation styles that do not always result in a smooth fabric or seamless text. And he says this in a positive way. And so I think one of the things that I'm going to say is that, if you like, the kind of logic of case studies adding up to a comparative study is something that we attempted in this project to transcend. Yeah, the sense also of these three practitioners and me, perhaps a generation slightly ahead, coming together at the time of the pandemic was also something important in bringing a community together to try to firstly establish continuity with some of these ideas. And it's great that Julia mentioned already a reference from the 60s, because I think that sense that you can use that reflective community to position your work in a way that makes you feel it has additional value, and also that it might connect to a bigger community, which you don't immediately form part of, is really important, and it helps make those arguments for the connections between research and practice. So my contribution was going to be as interlocutor, but not just in the sense of asking questions, but also to look at the transformational possibilities of moving from, if you like, this expository form of knowledge production, which is primarily personally reflective, again, as Julia talked about, to a kind of knowledge that can only be produced in discussion. I just put up these notes on the right-hand side to show that making the chapter happen was, in fact, it was a very intense piece of writing up, if you like, but it wasn't as straightforward as simply having a conversation and then writing it up, because, well, for example, in the first iteration, I produced more than 20,000 words. I think I produced 25,000 words, and the book plan had it down at something like 4,000 or 5,000. So we looked at reframing it, but that whole process helped us to develop something which, if you like, could help rethink the learning from the process. So my argument really is that it's a very productive thing to do, which was good in generating knowledge for those involved, as well as, if you like, for the output of the book. Okay, sorry. Yes, so I'm going to organize my remarks in these 4 senses. Firstly, what the form of that knowledge was that we produced, and that is evidenced not just in this chapter, but in the book, as a set of reflective possibilities, and then where the knowledge is, because I'm going to argue that the knowledge is not situated only in the book, but elsewhere. One of the things that came up quite a lot in the conversation and then in our exchanges by email afterwards, and in some of the conversations with Paulo, was what this meant for, what these reflections meant for how we practice. There were many questions coming from all of my 3 colleagues on this, questions for themselves, how to take this kind of practice forward, to make it work in a way that satisfied their research objectives as well as their practice objectives, that we don't feel as practitioner researchers that we're always torn between the two, but that there's a sense of connectedness to the forms of practice others have as well. And then this question of criticality with regard to being situated in real times and places. So firstly, with regard to the question of the form of knowing, I became very interested in the idea that discussion itself as a form of knowledge production can be very powerful. It may be the context of the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, might be familiar to many of you, and often in the REF, journal papers are seen as the main way you produce research. But in fact, some of the most productive research happens in dialogue, and it's through dialogue or in discussion more broadly that value really comes about, because you're pushed out of your comfort zone in some ways, and you have to defend your position in a much more rigorous way than simply, the rigor of citing well-known sources. So my key point here is to shine a light on the way that discussion can issue new dimensions of knowledge. As a PhD student supervisor, or as many of you will identify, or as a peer reviewer for journals, for example, you always find that it's in the discussion that many writers or students struggle. But those dimensions of comparison analysis, interpretation, recognition, as I've put on the screen, actually are where a lot of the intellectual work takes place. And what was interesting about this discussion is it was in thinking through each other's perspectives and really appreciating those points of view and those struggles, and the amazing capacity for celebration, for example, that Elisa managed to elicit through her projects, and then the impossibility of moving forwards that Julia experienced when the developer placard went up. Those kinds of struggles become a point of recognition, and therefore not only acknowledgement, but reinforcement, which build confidence in the researcher. So that knowledge that gets produced has a force and a direction to it, which, if you like, becomes more productive than simply being stuck on the page. And there's a dynamic of understanding involved in the work of discussion, which can move towards transcending the content of what is on the table at the start, at your starting point. And so I think that this essential collegiality was a message that came back to me afterwards. And I really hope that this little group of the four of us can meet again and take this work forwards, because that collegiality builds a form of knowledge that then, if I go to my next point, is not just located in us, but is on the page, but is distributed in the people. This is something that's really important to participatory research. And it's something that I discuss with my students who are doing participatory work, that the knowledge you produce is often more than what ends up on the page or in the essay, but ends up distributed in the community or in your community, in your constituency, and that gives it additional value. We discussed this question of the location of knowledge and also the location of expertise in the preparation of this chapter, and the extent to which knowledge becomes mobilized as a kind of a sense of reflection on your own disposition and in your professional role was another point that we came up to discuss. And some of the images on the right-hand side show work from Paulo, from Elisa, and from Julia, where some of the lessons they have learned from knowledge which, if you like, has been produced in these experiences or cases in the global South, can then lead to lessons which become applicable in completely different contexts. In Paulo's case, in Portugal; in Julia's case, in London; in Elisa's case, in Miami. So that was a very interesting set of reflections that helped us to take the contribution of this chapter forwards. Okay, so the next point, which what I've done in some of these, I'm not talking directly about them, but I'm just showing text on the right-hand side from the book, which addresses these particular issues in chapter 4, and then some key sources which address them. In the previous slide, I had a book by the previous one is a book by Maurice Mitchell with Bo Tang and Shamin Patwari, which talks about the architect's role. And then in this slide, I have Ivan Illich's Deschooling Society and John Turner's Housing by People, which were key sources when we started to talk about what that expertise and practice environment is for the architect. Because architects tend to get quite a bashing in humanitarian and development practice. And it's often a well-intentioned and kind of bashing that we get, and sometimes not. But sometimes it becomes almost a knee-jerk reaction to find fault in how the architect practices. But one of the things that we started to discuss and to discover in the conversation that took place in the preparation of chapter 4 was that there are skills that the architect has been trained with, but needs to, if you like, forget what it is to be an architect in conventional practice, to relearn and to pick up the real values, especially placemaking values that, if you like, come more naturally to spatial thinkers. The framing of a relationship between spatial and social thinking is something that doesn't come easily to many people, but having produced project after project for several years, we as architects can often think through that more usefully. So this relationship between unlearning and learning, between schooling and unschooling, is one that we discussed and that we explore. And Julia's point about learning from failure is important in this. Those placemaking tools can also help us to understand, through learning from the global south, if you like, the ways in which some of the ways of making cities that we have in the global north are really terrible traps. And Elisa, in our conversation, came up with a wonderful phrase where she talked about our city making practices as patterns of submission. We almost give the keys away to our cities in the global north and divorce ourselves as citizens from being part of it. And finally, on this point of spatial practice, the question of the role of the neighborhood and its criticality as a scale in between the individual and between the urban scale, which is something that as architects we often limit the extent of our architectural thinking to just the building. And finally, this issue about how to think through and find meaning in these urban contexts in a way that matters and that we can position ourselves there. The issue of life world is one that is very important. Very many studies and even PhD research projects concerning whether it's urbanism in the global south or development practice tend to be prejudiced towards the kind of policy fix genre. This book title that is shown on the bottom right-hand side, Rogue Urbanism, I had the good fortune to be invited by Edgar Peterson and Abdou Maliq Simone many years ago to join a project from the African Center for Cities, which was looking at urban theory. And one of the findings that Abdou Maliq and particularly Edgar found, and Edgar wrote about this in his opening chapter in this book, was that this policy genre fix tended to edit out the life world of what it is to really experience and be in a city in the global south. And of course, in Africa, for example, what we know is that Africa is a younger continent than any other continent in the world. And that it is in Africa where, if you like, much of the future will be invented and experienced over the next several decades. And so that sense of being situated in that reality and being able to understand what it means is very important. However, this happens at a time of great mobility. So what we should also be understanding in relation to those situations of massive change is that the resistance of places is important to grab hold of. Okay, I'm going to end it there and hand back to Paulo to just say a couple of words wrapping up before we go to discuss. Over to you, Paulo.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you all. It was very, well, it's always inspiring, but really great to have the chance to reread your chapters and look at the images that are obviously more extended than in the book version. So I would say, instead of handing over to me, I wonder, Matthew, if you could carry on with the conversation, because I have the browser version of Teams and I cannot see any questions and stuff.
Absolutely.
Maybe. Thank you.
Sure. So what we're going, we for those of you who joined late, I'm very sorry about the glitch at the beginning, but what we decided, we started a little late. We have about 10 minutes left for discussion, and if there are lots of questions, we might go a little bit over time. I'd like to invite anybody who would like to do so to put up your hand, and we can come to you with questions. Just to kick off, it was very exciting for me to see again these three projects and to be reminded actually of some of the overlaps, because I think the point that I was trying to make in revisiting the function of the conversation was to say that actually it's very easy to see this book as a comparative study. But in the end, I think that the nuances of change and comparison ended up leading to discussions which actually add up to more than that, and give us a sense of perspective. And I think one of the things that I would be very interested to hear about, in both your cases, Julia and Paulo, you were witness to neighborhoods that, in your case, Paulo, literally before your very eyes, a neighborhood that was erased. Julia, in your case, I guess T Camp maybe is on its way to being erased. It might be a slower process. But that sense of having a comparative understanding and overlap of what might befall a neighborhood that can be so out of control that it just disappears. But by contrast, Elisa, you've been working in a neighborhood that you have made visible, not only made visible to itself, helped to make visible to itself, but helped the people take ownership of it. And I think that question of having these forces that are beyond their control in the framing and making of the neighborhood might invite, some space for reflection. So that's not a very clear question, but I guess my question is, perhaps for Julia or for Paulo, looking at these comparisons between these three neighborhoods, do you think that there is more that can be done or that could be done by the architect, or how much can one do when a neighborhood is so fundamentally at threat?
Paulo, do you want to start?
Yes. Matthew, would you like to stop sharing the screen? Maybe we can be...
I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Yeah.
Larger.
Got it.
No problem. But that was the key question when I started my PhD, because I aimed at developing a practice-based research. So for a while, I was struggling with what is the design part of my PhD. And I realized that my design aspect could be to create an archive about the history and the culture of this place, because it would, I knew it would disappear. So I felt it would be more relevant if I accept that my role is not really fighting against a case that is pretty much sealed. That we knew that the site would disappear. So why would we build any, say, small public space or do some sort of building design in some scale in Chicala, instead drawing up the site and recording it as it was, by drawing plans and elevations, axonometrics, and really literally drawing up a place that would no longer exist soon. So I think this is something that is quite powerful as well, because being able to present the project elsewhere, outside Angola, even in contexts where people are not so familiar with this case, that is a very powerful. I think it's a very powerful thing, because architects can then can have the power that, say, to critique and question those urban master plans that these embody people from large swaths of people from the sites, without being heard or without being part of the negotiation or relocation process in some way. And I felt then the archive became really a stronger contribution that is still ongoing, is still alive, even if the neighborhood is not. So I think that was my approach about it.
Thanks, Paulo.
At the risk of turning this into a kind of professional online Zoom therapy session, I think I had this kind of, I found it really tough actually, because I had this sort of moment of the big penny dropping, where I really felt that actually my role that could be the most productive was to really help local activists. Like Shuleka wanted to put forward a plan for a housing plan, and I really at the time, right before the pandemic, was thinking that that was my future role, if it should be me at all. And circumstance, where I think, and now I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, I realized that what I did with that moment of realizing, oh God, I can't design my way out of this, it has actually, I really rejected the role of teaching. I kind of almost did teaching in truth as a kind of side act. And for me, this has been part of my journey, where I've realized that actually the most impact that I can have with my skill set to get to that end is to actually empower. And I think, Matthew, you were talking about it when we're talking about participatory practices. It's fundamentally about putting knowledge in the hand of local people to do what they want to do with it. And that can be relevant in the UK or in India or anywhere. And so much of my work since TCAP has been fundamentally using my role at the LSE and thinking about a system and designing that system by which we can, create peer knowledge, and that knowledge is held firmly in the hands of local people. And in my case, I'm using my capacity as a teacher, as a pedagogy, to do that. And so much now of my work, and even other work that I've been doing at the center around in Ethiopia, it's about capacity building, whether that be local students, local municipal workers in Peru. And so I feel like over the pandemic years, I've changed from being someone who would attempt to deliver a project to someone to facilitate other people to deliver their own projects. I've really enjoyed that journey.
I mean, Elisa, just to come over to you on this, I was also very touched, and it's interesting what, Julia, you're saying about the transformation of that architectural role, but it was quite touching because I haven't seen this before, but to see the extent to which that community center that you started to develop on that previously abandoned site has now got, I think you said something like 30 events a week, if I heard correctly. And then you had this phrase, which in preparing for today, I looked at that wonderful phrase that you had said about how in the global north, we tend to give the keys away to the city and have this pattern of submission. And the phrase you used is that everybody is getting a key to this place, which is an extraordinary, I don't know, like a symbol of ownership. We think of these ceremonies of the London mayor being given the keys to the city, or Dick Whittington, or whoever it is. I guess just wondering whether for you, because that's a very architectural project, yet it's one that's built on all of those skills that you have of pulling communities together and working with artists to do that. Do you think that return to architecture as a spatial practice has also been a useful symbol and appreciated by your colleagues and all the neighborhood?
It's an excellent question, and I'm always wrestling with how much of a heavy hand to keep and how much to let go. I mean, it's and it's been just a beautiful kind of growing experience for myself. Negotiating with all the folks that are participating there, and that by no means would I want to ever do anything to push them away. On the contrary, their suggestions, their ideas, their involvement is extraordinary and always welcome. So I'd just like to go back on the previous question real quick and then tie it into this one, is that I do believe we can, as a discipline, contribute with these archives, as Paulo has recorded, with the chimeric situation that Julia came across in trying to bring some livelihood or improved livelihood to the neighbors, is that the way that neighborhoods that are self-built by folks exist and have occurred, they have a lot more value than what obviously the real estate market gives them, or what developers give them, or what the city itself, in the case of India, I know they're completely complicit with development. And in a parallel way, I've been just very interested in what are mechanisms that have allowed places to remain and to stay outside of those kinds of eminent risks that are so, frequent in many places. And the one model that I found that's been, it was sort of homegrown in Puerto Rico, was for a community to become a land trust. They collectively preferred to become a land trust than to become individual owners of each of their small homes. And as that larger trust could remain a whole lot more, remain a lot stronger in the face of other folks' interests, because it would just need to go through a more complex process. And likewise, in Mexico, in work that we're doing with rural communities in Oaxaca, they are communal lands that have existed, some since pre-colonial times, that have continued in spite of, the changing government regimes. And then after the Porfiriato, the ejido structure was reinstated, and a lot of Mexico is actually communal land. And some of it has changed and evolved, but a lot of it, especially in the South, has remained in the hands of the villagers. And, not that we are lawyers, and not that we need to sort of add more and more complexity to our profession, but I think being curious and finding mechanisms legally that have operated and worked, and that we could, make visible, celebrate them, is important. Because I don't believe for a second, and nor do any of us here, that horrific development that was going to go up in New Delhi was better than the neighborhood that was there, nor whatever's being produced in Chikala, and that's a hard sell for a whole lot of people. And I think we need to get better at explaining why that does not make sense, and giving communities tools and sort of trying to balance the power that they don't have. That said, in Venezuela, in Caracas, who knows if in the future these kinds of pressures will come. I mean, we've been underinvested or divested for the past couple of decades in a serious way, so we don't have these kinds of land pressures, and definitely not in the barrios. And the difficulty instead has been, to acknowledge them as part of the city, basically my phrase that I keep on repeating all the time. And in that acknowledgement, I'm finding more and more that there are so many ways to argue that the way things happen in a barrio are just so much better than the way they happen in some other neighborhoods of the city. And this place, which is just becoming so full of energy, and it's not just the folks from the barrio, but it's all sorts of other artists and people from other communities who are delighted that there's a place where they can come and teach children how to play the piano, or that this is open to their input and their suggestions, not having ever found a place even remotely like that, let's say in the planned quote part of the city. And the space that we've been able to kind of give activity and energy to again has done so slowly. And so as groups appear and interests arise, we get a chance to be like, okay, this should be a library because that's where the forces are taking it. And this maybe needs a mirror now because the dancers that are here would really appreciate having a mirror on that wall. And, there's some folks that are really interested in cooking and teaching cooking. So let's make this space work for a cooking school. And that I think will continue to evolve and change as, folks come and start. Those tables are now a market on some days. And I've just really enjoyed watching others' creativity and proposals and knowing that somehow everybody perceives this place to be a location for them to propose stuff, whatever comes to their mind. That's just, I can't say enough how my hairs come to an end when I enter and see this place being used that way. And the touch of the architect ultimately, which was your question, I feel is pretty light. And I think for most architecture professionals would probably really question where it is and at all. I mean, I think maybe you guys are super sensitive and you do see it, but
I think,
you know.
I mean, what was interesting is that when we had this conversation earlier, I think the message came around and we started to appreciate, I mean, when you say the touch of the architect is quite light, I guess my point would be the skill comes in knowing what the light touch is, and also understanding, I think, what the process is behind making something happen, which I think can really be very enabling. And that was a big learning point for me in reflecting across these projects, because there, on the one hand, there were these moments where Julia was saying, well, there is just no time anymore. Time is out of control. And, you know, you suddenly realize that you're completely helpless. Whereas in Paulo, your case, you discovered that actually as an architect, you could produce something for a hopeless situation, which is this archive, and also building through spatial practices a kind of social presence with regard to the history of this place that has disappeared. Anyway, I'm gonna. It's now after 7 o'clock, and we haven't had anybody put up their hand, although I know that many of these issues resonate with a number of the people who've been in the audience this evening. I think everyone's off to get their dinner. So I'm going to suggest we go back to Paulo for some closing words, and then close the session. Paulo.
Great. Matthew, just very quickly to thank everyone. It was a pleasure once again to be able to now in public share our conversations and our thoughts. And the process of the book, like you said, was much longer than the number of words that we were able to print. I hope we continue these conversations in wherever elsewhere. I think I'm sure we will cross paths, and this project hopefully can open up paths for our encounters. And I think that the book, I hope it presents viable ways of practicing architecture in neighborhoods that are silenced and excluded and facing demolition, for instance. I hope it contributes to questioning also the conventional relationship between architectural practice and research, and between academic and socio-political structures as well. To me, and just to conclude, I hope the book also demonstrates that the city is capable of empowering and including people and their neighborhoods rather than excluding them. Thank you all again, and keep in touch.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.